On the evening of March 15th, 1854, in the grand ballroom of the Charleston Hotel in South Carolina, a drunken plantation owner named Beauregard Ashton accepted a bet that would destroy his family's legacy and change the lives of everyone who knew him. The wager was simple but shocking. He would legally marry his enslaved cook, a woman named Delilah, who weighed over 300 pounds and whom the other wealthy men at the party had been mocking all evening. If he went through with an actual, legal marriage and lived as her husband for 1 full year, he would win $10,000 and the respect of the men who believed he would never have the courage to degrade himself so completely. Beauregard, arrogant and certain he could endure anything for money and status, agreed immediately. The marriage took place 3 days later, but what began as a cruel joke became something far more complex and dangerous than anyone anticipated. Because Delilah was not the simple, uneducated slave woman these wealthy white men assumed she was. She was brilliant, calculating, and had been waiting years for an opportunity exactly like this. By the time the year ended, Beauregard Ashton would be ruined. His plantation would be in Delilah's control, and 7 of the men who had laughed at the bet would be dead under circumstances that authorities could never quite explain. Before we descend into this tale of pride, revenge, and the most dangerous marriage in South Carolina history, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epic of Fear, where we uncover the stories that reveal the hidden violence and resistance within the slavery system that history tried to forget. Charleston, South Carolina in 1854 was the jewel of the South, a city of immense wealth built entirely on the backs of enslaved people who outnumbered white residents nearly 2 to 1. The city's elite lived lives of extraordinary luxury with multiple homes, extensive wardrobes imported from Europe, and social calendars filled with balls, parties, and elaborate dinners where they displayed their wealth and reinforced the social hierarchies that kept them in power. These were people who genuinely believed they represented the pinnacle of civilization, that their system of slavery was not just economically necessary, but morally superior, and that their refined culture justified any cruelty required to maintain it. The men who gathered at the Charleston Hotel on March 15, 1854, were among the wealthiest in South Carolina. They owned tens of thousands of acres combined, controlled hundreds of enslaved people, and wielded political power that extended to the state legislature and beyond. They were Beauregard Ashton, owner of Ashton Hall Plantation, with 247 enslaved workers; Colonel Marcus Whitfield, a retired military officer with 3 plantations; Judge Harrison Blackwood, who presided over cases involving enslaved people, and always ruled in favor of white owners; the Grantham brothers, Thomas and William, whose family had owned land in South Carolina since the 1690s, and 3 others whose wealth and power made them untouchable by normal standards of law or morality. These men gathered regularly to drink, gamble, and entertain themselves with increasingly outrageous wagers and challenges that demonstrated their wealth and willingness to engage in behavior that would have scandalized their wives and families. Evening of March 15th had begun normally enough, with expensive wine, imported cigars, and card games where single hands involved more money than most people would see in a lifetime. The conversation had turned, as it often did among these men, to the enslaved people they owned and the various ways they asserted their dominance and control. Someone mentioned Beauregard Ashton's cook, Delilah, a woman who had become something of a legend in Charleston's enslaved community for her extraordinary cooking abilities, but also for her size. Delilah weighed over 300 pounds at a time when most enslaved people were kept deliberately underfed, and her appearance had become a source of crude jokes among the white men who had eaten her cooking at Ashton Hall. Colonel Whitfield, deep in his cups and looking for entertainment, made a comment about how amusing it would be to see Beauregard married to that enormous negress who cooks his meals. The other men laughed, and the conversation spiraled into increasingly vulgar speculation about such a marriage. Beauregard, whose pride was legendary, even among men known for arrogance, initially laughed along, but grew irritated as the jokes continued and seemed to question his masculinity and status. When Judge Blackwood suggested that Beauregard would never have the courage to actually go through with such a degrading arrangement, Beauregard's temper flared. He declared that he could do anything required to prove his superiority, and that these men underestimated his strength of will. Thomas Grantham, seeing an opportunity for entertainment, and perhaps sensing Beauregard's vulnerability, proposed the formal wager. The terms were specific and designed to be as humiliating as possible, while still being achievable. Beauregard would legally marry Delilah in a ceremony recognized by law, not just a slave marriage that had no legal standing. He would live with her as husband and wife, maintaining the appearance of a genuine marriage in public and private. He would introduce her as Mrs. Ashton in social situations. He would share sleeping quarters with her, and he would do this for 1 full year from the date of marriage. If he completed the year without divorcing her or abandoning the arrangement, he would receive $10,000 contributed equally by the 7 other men present, and his courage and strength of will would be acknowledged as superior to theirs. But if he failed to complete the year, he would forfeit $5,000 of his own money to be split among them, and he would be forever known as a man who lacked the fortitude to endure temporary discomfort for significant gain. The wager included provisions that Delilah would remain enslaved throughout, so there was no risk of her claiming actual rights as a legal wife, and that Beauregard could end the marriage after exactly 1 year with no legal complications. Multiple lawyers were present in the room and confirmed that such an arrangement, while highly unusual and likely to cause scandal, was technically legal under South Carolina law. A contract was drawn up immediately, signed by all parties and witnessed by 3 attorneys who would later claim they had believed it was all a drunken joke that would never actually be carried out. But Beauregard Ashton, driven by pride and greed in equal measure, was completely serious. He would show these men that he was superior in every way, that he could endure anything they proposed, and that his will was stronger than any of theirs. He shook hands on the wager and declared that the marriage would take place within 1 week. Delilah learned of the wager the next morning when Beauregard summoned her to his study at Ashton Hall. He was hungover and irritable, but still committed to the plan. He explained to Delilah that she would be married to him in a legal ceremony, that she would act as his wife in all respects for 1 year, and that if she performed this role adequately, he would consider rewarding her with better accommodations, or perhaps lighter work assignments after the year ended. He made clear that this changed nothing about her status as his property, that she would still be enslaved and subject to his absolute authority, and that if she caused any problems or embarrassed him during this year, he would sell her to the worst plantation he could find. Delilah, who had survived 34 years of slavery through intelligence and careful observation of the white people who owned her, understood immediately that she was being given an opportunity that might never come again. She had been born enslaved in Virginia, sold 3 times before ending up at Ashton Hall 8 years earlier, and had survived by being useful enough to be valuable, but not so remarkable that she attracted dangerous attention. Her size, which other enslaved people sometimes envied because it suggested she ate well, was actually a deliberate choice. Delilah had learned early that appearing fat and somewhat slow made white people underestimate her, assume she was simple-minded and content with her position, and ignore her presence during conversations they should have kept private. She had spent years listening, learning, and waiting for any chance to change her circumstances. And now Beauregard Ashton, in his arrogance, was handing her exactly the chance she needed. She lowered her eyes submissively and agreed to everything he proposed, playing the role of the grateful slave who could not believe her good fortune. Beauregard, satisfied that she understood her place, dismissed her and began making arrangements for a wedding that would shock Charleston society. The marriage took place on March 18, 1854, just 3 days after the wager was made. Beauregard had considered trying to keep the ceremony private, but the terms of the bet required that it be a legal marriage, which meant it had to be recorded in county records and conducted by someone authorized to perform marriages. He chose a minister known for asking few questions as long as the fee was adequate, and the ceremony was held in a small chapel on the outskirts of Charleston with only the 8 men from the wager present as witnesses. The minister, Reverend Aldrich, was clearly uncomfortable but performed the ceremony after Beauregard explained that Delilah was actually a free woman of mixed race rather than an enslaved person, a lie that made the marriage technically legal, but that everyone present knew was false. Delilah wore a simple dress that Beauregard had purchased for her, stood beside him at the altar, and spoke the vows when required. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, Reverend Aldrich pronounced them man and wife, made a notation in his church records that he would later try unsuccessfully to erase, and accepted his fee before leaving as quickly as possible. The 7 men who had made the wager with Beauregard congratulated him mockingly and reminded him that they would be watching closely to ensure he fulfilled all the terms. Beauregard, already regretting his decision, but too proud to back out, took Delilah's arm and led her to his carriage for the ride back to Ashton Hall. The year had begun. The first month of the marriage was exactly as awful as Beauregard had anticipated. He moved Delilah into the main house, into rooms adjacent to his own that had previously been used for storage, and made a show of treating her as his wife when other people were present. This required him to sit beside her at meals, to speak to her with at least superficial politeness, and to acknowledge her presence in his home when visitors came to call. Charleston society reacted with predictable shock and outrage. Beauregard's family was horrified, with his elderly mother refusing to visit Ashton Hall as long as that creature was living there, and his sisters writing letters begging him to explain what madness had possessed him. His friends and business associates treated the situation as either a scandalous joke or a sign that Beauregard had lost his mind. Invitations to social events stopped arriving. Women who had previously considered Beauregard a desirable match despite his reputation for drinking and gambling now looked at him with disgust. The clergy denounced him from pulpits. Newspaper editors wrote carefully worded editorials about the degradation of Southern society and the importance of maintaining racial purity and social hierarchies. Beauregard endured all of this with growing rage and resentment, taking out his frustration on Delilah through constant verbal abuse and occasional physical violence that left no visible marks but made clear who held actual power in their arrangement. He told her repeatedly that she was disgusting, that he could barely stand to be in the same room with her, that the only reason he did not sell her immediately was the money he would win at the end of the year. Delilah accepted all of this abuse, without visible reaction, playing the role of the submissive slave wife who knew her place. But privately, she was studying everything about Beauregard Ashton, learning his weaknesses, his fears, his secrets, and planning how to use the power he had inadvertently given her. The second month brought the first signs that Delilah was not what she appeared to be. Beauregard, drinking heavily and growing increasingly isolated as Charleston society shunned him, began spending less time monitoring Delilah's activities and more time feeling sorry for himself. This gave Delilah freedom to move through Ashton Hall and interact with the other enslaved people who worked there. She began asking questions, learning about the plantation's operations, understanding the relationships between different enslaved. workers, and between them and Beauregard. She discovered that Beauregard was deeply in debt, despite his appearance of wealth, that he had borrowed extensively to maintain his lifestyle and was relying on successful cotton crops to avoid financial ruin. She learned which overseers were cruel and which were merely doing their jobs, which enslaved people were trustworthy and which would inform on others to gain favor. She identified the plantation's vulnerabilities, the places where Beauregard's management was weak or careless, the records he kept poorly, the corners he cut to save money. All of this information she filed away carefully, not yet sure how she would use it, but certain that knowledge was power and that she was accumulating more power than anyone realized. She also began subtly changing the household dynamics at Ashton Hall. As Beauregard's legal wife, even though enslaved, she had a status that confused other enslaved workers and created opportunities. She started giving orders to house servants, claiming to be acting on Beauregard's authority, and most obeyed because they were not sure what her actual status was and feared punishment if they refused. She reorganized the kitchen operations, supposedly to improve efficiency, but actually to create loyal allies among the other enslaved cooks and house workers. She began treating some enslaved people better than Beauregard did, sharing extra food and showing small kindnesses that created gratitude and loyalty. Within 2 months, Delilah had created an informal network of people at Ashton Hall who saw her as an authority figure separate from Fong and potentially superior to the white overseers. About the 3rd month brought the first death. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, one of the men who had wagered against Beauregard, died suddenly at his plantation under circumstances that were never fully explained. He had been in good health, 53 years old and vigorous, with no history of serious illness. But he was found dead in his study one morning, his face twisted in an expression of agony, his body showing signs of convulsions. The doctor, who examined him, suspected poison, but could not prove it, and without proof, no investigation was launched. Enslaved people were questioned, but all claimed to know nothing, and without evidence connecting anyone to the death, the matter was closed. Colonel Whitfield was buried with full honors, his death attributed to sudden heart failure, and life continued. Only 2 people recognized that this death might be connected to the wager made in March. Delilah knew, because she had arranged it through an enslaved woman who worked at Whitfield's plantation, a woman Delilah had contacted through the network of communication that enslaved people maintained despite all efforts to prevent it. And Beauregard suspected, because he knew that Whitfield had been particularly cruel in his mockery of Delilah during the card game, and because he was beginning to realize that his wife was far more intelligent and capable than he had assumed. But Beauregard said nothing, because admitting that his enslaved wife might be murdering wealthy white men would make him look either foolish or complicit, and because he was not entirely sure he was right. The death might have been natural. Coincidences happened, and speaking publicly would require explaining the wager, which would increase the scandal around him. So Beauregard stayed silent and began watching Delilah more carefully, trying to determine what she was really capable of. The 4th and 5th months passed with a growing tension at Ashton Hall that everyone could feel, but no one could quite identify. Beauregard had begun drinking earlier in the day and more heavily, trying to numb the humiliation of his situation and the growing suspicion that he had made a terrible mistake. He had stopped attending social events entirely because the mockery had become unbearable. He spent most of his time in his study, reviewing financial records and trying to find a way out of his debts that did not require completing the full year of marriage. But the numbers did not improve, no matter how many times he reviewed them. He needed the $10,000 from the wager, and he needed it desperately. This meant he had to endure 7 more months of being married to Delilah, 7 more months of social death, 7 more months of watching her move through his house as if she owned it. Because that was what Delilah was doing now. She had stopped even pretending to be submissive when they were alone. She spoke to Beauregard with barely concealed contempt, gave him advice he had not asked for about plantation management, corrected him when he made mistakes in household matters. She had taken over most of the day-to-day running of Ashton Hall, and Beauregard, too drunk or depressed to care, had let her. The enslaved workers now came to Delilah with questions before bothering Beauregard. The overseers reported to her about field operations. Even the white merchants who delivered supplies to the plantation had begun dealing with Delilah instead of Beauregard, because she was more organized and reliable. The power dynamic had completely reversed without anyone consciously deciding to reverse it, and Beauregard, trapped by pride and debt, could do nothing but watch it happen. The 6th month brought the second death. Judge Harrison Blackwood, who had presided over the card game where the wager was made and had been particularly enthusiastic about humiliating Beauregard, died in what was ruled an accidental fall from his horse. But witnesses said the horse had seemed to go mad suddenly, bucking and rearing despite being normally docile, and Blackwood had been thrown with such force that his neck broke on impact. The horse was later found to have been stung by something that left a mark consistent with a bee sting, but that occurred in a location and at a time of year when bees were not normally active. An investigation was launched, but went nowhere because proving that someone had deliberately spooked a horse to cause a fatal accident was nearly impossible. Judge Blackwood was buried with honors befitting his position, and life continued. But now 4 of the 8 men who had been present at the wager were beginning to feel uneasy. 2 of them were dead within 3 months. The odds of that being coincidence seemed increasingly small. Thomas Grantham, who had proposed the original wager, began asking questions quietly about both deaths, trying to determine if there was a connection. He learned that Colonel Whitfield's household had included several enslaved people who had been recently acquired, including one woman who had come from a plantation that had previously been owned by Beauregard Ashton. And Judge Blackwood's stable master had reported seeing a strange woman near the horses the morning of the accident, a large black woman who had disappeared before anyone could question her. Thomas began to suspect that Delilah was somehow involved, that she was using her position as Beauregard's wife to access enslaved people at other plantations and arrange accidents and poisonings. But he had no proof, and making such an accusation without proof would sound insane. How could an enslaved woman, even one with Delilah's unusual status, organize murders across multiple plantations? It was impossible. And yet 2 men were dead. The 7th month brought escalation. William Grantham, Thomas's brother, decided that the wager should be ended early. He approached Beauregard privately and offered to release him from the bet, to void the contract and let him divorce Delilah immediately, forfeiting his chance at the prize money, but also ending the social destruction and whatever danger seemed to be following the men involved in the wager. Beauregard, desperate and frightened, agreed immediately. They drafted a document ending the wager, signed it, and began making arrangements for Beauregard to divorce Delilah. But before the divorce could be finalized, William Grantham died in a fire that destroyed his Charleston townhouse. He was the only person in the building who died, despite multiple enslaved servants who all managed to escape. The fire had started in William's bedroom while he slept, and by the time he woke, the room was engulfed in flames. He died from smoke inhalation before rescuers could reach him. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by a fallen candle, but William Grantham had not used candles in his bedroom for years, preferring oil lamps that were safer and provided better light. Someone had placed that candle near flammable materials, someone who knew William's habits and knew he would not wake until it was too late. And Beauregard, when he heard about the fire, knew with absolute certainty that Delilah had arranged it. She had learned about William's offer to end the wager. She had decided that ending the wager early was not acceptable because it meant she would lose her position as Beauregard's wife and return to being just another enslaved cook with no power or protection. So she had killed William before the divorce could be finalized, and she had sent a clear message to Beauregard and the other men. The wager would continue to its conclusion, and anyone who tried to interfere would die. Beauregard confronted Delilah that same night, drunk and terrified and furious. He accused her of murdering 3 men, of using enslaved people from multiple plantations to carry out killings, of turning what was supposed to be a simple wager into a nightmare that was destroying everyone involved. Delilah did not deny anything. She looked at Beauregard with cold contempt and told him exactly what she thought. "You made me your wife to win a bet," she said. "You thought you could use me for a year and then throw me away when you collected your money. You thought I was too stupid and too grateful to understand what you were doing, but I understood perfectly. And I decided that if I was going to be Mrs. Beauregard Ashton for a year, I would use that year to destroy every man who laughed at me, who made me part of their cruel game, who treated me like I was nothing more than a joke. Colonel Whitfield is dead because he suggested this whole idea and mocked my appearance. Judge Blackwood is dead because he administered the laws that kept me enslaved and found it amusing to make you marry me. William Grantham is dead because he tried to end the wager early and take away my power before I was finished using it. And the others will die too, one by one, until the year ends, and I am done with all of you." Beauregard, shaking with rage and fear, threatened to have Delilah arrested, to reveal everything she had done, to see her hanged for murder. But Delilah laughed at him. "And what proof do you have?" she asked. "Who would believe that an enslaved woman organized murders across Charleston? Who would believe that I am intelligent enough, connected enough, powerful enough to arrange all of this? And even if they believed you, what would that make you? The man who married a murderer, who lived with her for months without noticing what she was doing, who gave her the position and protection she needed to kill wealthy white men. You would be destroyed along with me. Your family would be ruined. Your name would be forever associated with the greatest scandal in South Carolina history. So you will say nothing, and you will continue this marriage for the remaining 5 months, and when the year ends, you will collect your blood money, and we will end this arrangement. But until then, I am Mrs. Ashton, and you will treat me accordingly." Beauregard had no response to this because he knew she was right. He was trapped completely, bound by the contract he had signed and by the fear of what Delilah would do if he tried to escape. So he said nothing about the murders, continued the marriage, and began drinking even more heavily to cope with the knowledge that his wife was a killer and he was powerless to stop her. The 8th and 9th months brought relative calm, which was somehow worse than the violence had been. No one else died, but the 4 remaining men who had made the wager lived in constant fear, wondering when and how Delilah would strike next. They hired bodyguards, they changed their routines, they avoided going anywhere alone. But they could not escape the network of enslaved people who moved through Charleston, carrying information and taking instructions from Delilah, who had become something like a general, commanding an invisible army of people who had been waiting their entire lives for a chance to strike back at their oppressors. Thomas Grantham, now terrified for his life after his brother's death, tried to arrange for Delilah to be killed quietly, hiring men who specialized in such work. But every attempt failed because Delilah was protected by enslaved people who warned her of danger and who sabotaged the hired killer's plans. One assassin died from food poisoning the day before he was supposed to kill Delilah. Another was injured in a suspicious accident that left him unable to walk. A third simply disappeared, never to be seen again. Thomas began to understand that he was not fighting just Delilah, but an entire community of enslaved people who had decided she was valuable enough to protect and who saw killing her enemies as part of their own resistance to slavery. The 10th month brought a confrontation that would change everything. Beauregard, now completely broken by alcohol and fear, had stopped even pretending to manage Ashton Hall. Delilah ran everything now, giving orders to overseers who obeyed because they did not know what else to do, managing the plantation's finances. Because Beauregard was too drunk to do it, making decisions about planting and harvesting because someone had to, and Beauregard was incapable. The enslaved people at Ashton Hall had begun to see Delilah as their actual owner, the person who controlled their lives and determined their fates. This was a dangerous inversion of the entire social order, and people began to notice. The sheriff of Charleston County received reports that something strange was happening at Ashton Hall, that an enslaved woman appeared to be running the plantation while the white owner drank himself to death. An investigation was launched. Officials came to Ashton Hall to interview Beauregard and determine what was happening. Beauregard, confronted by authorities and required to explain himself, had to make a choice. He could tell the truth about the wager and about Delilah's murders and about how completely she had taken control of his plantation. Or he could lie and protect what little remained of his reputation and hope to survive until the year ended. He chose to lie. He told the officials that he had been ill, that his wife Delilah was helping to manage household affairs during his recovery, that everything was under control and there was no cause for concern. The officials, confused by his reference to his wife, since they knew Beauregard had never been married as far as public records showed, asked for clarification. Beauregard had to show them the marriage certificate, had to admit that he had legally married an enslaved woman, had to endure their shock, and the 11th month brought the 4th death. Thomas Grantham, who had been living in terror since his brother's murder, died in what appeared to be a suicide. He was found in his study with a pistol in his hand and a bullet through his brain. But people who knew him insisted that Thomas would never have killed himself, that he was too proud and too religious to commit such an act. An investigation found that Thomas had recently written letters expressing fear for his life and suggesting that he was being hunted by someone connected to the Beauregard-Ashton marriage scandal. But the letters were vague and did not name anyone. Specifically, and without concrete evidence of murder, the death was ruled a suicide. 4 men dead. 4 men remaining from the original wager, Beauregard, and 3 others who had not been as prominent in the mockery, but who were still marked for death by Delilah's methodical revenge. These 3 men, separately and together, began trying to find a way to end the nightmare they had created. They offered Beauregard money to divorce Delilah immediately, regardless of the consequences. They threatened to expose the whole scandal publicly if the marriage did not end. They even approached Delilah directly, offering her freedom and money if she would leave Charleston and never return. But Delilah refused every offer. She wanted the full year. She wanted every man who had laughed at her dead or ruined, and she wanted the world to know that an enslaved woman could destroy the most powerful men in South Carolina if they gave her the opportunity. Motivation. The 12th and final month arrived, 1 year since the marriage, 1 year since Beauregard. Ashton had accepted a drunken wager that had destroyed his life. The terms of the bet specified that the marriage must last exactly 12 months from the wedding date, which meant it would end on March 18, 1855. Beauregard counted down the days desperately, believing that if he could just survive until that date, he could divorce Delilah, collect whatever remained of the prize money, and try to rebuild his life. The 3 remaining men from the wager were also counting down, hoping that Delilah would be satisfied with 4 deaths and would let them live once the marriage ended. But Delilah had different plans. On March 10th, 8 days before the marriages, end date, she told Beauregard that she had no intention of agreeing to a divorce. As his legal wife, she had rights that even enslaved women possessed in marriage. She could refuse to divorce him. She could insist on remaining Mrs. Ashton indefinitely. And if Beauregard tried to force a divorce, she would reveal everything. About the wager, about the murders, about how he had known what she was doing and said nothing. She would destroy what little remained of his reputation and likely get him arrested as an accessory to murder. Beauregard, trapped absolutely, asked what she wanted. Delilah's terms were simple: transfer of Ashton Hall to her ownership, legal freedom for herself and 50 enslaved people of her choosing, and $20,000 in cash. If Beauregard agreed to these terms, she would grant him a divorce and disappear from Charleston. If he refused, she would remain his wife forever and continue killing the men who had made the wager until none remained. Beauregard had no choice. He agreed to everything. The transfer was complicated because enslaved people could not legally own property, but Delilah had anticipated this problem. She had Beauregard create a trust that would hold Ashton Hall and the money, with her designated as the trust's sole beneficiary and administrator. She had him draft manumission papers for herself and the 50 enslaved people she selected, all loyal members of the network she had built over the past year. She had him sign documents that would make everything legal and binding. And she had lawyers present to witness every signature and ensure that Beauregard could not later claim he had been coerced. The lawyers, confused but paid well for their services, drafted documents that effectively stripped Beauregard of everything he owned and transferred it to a formerly enslaved woman. On March 17, 1855, one day before the year ended, all documents were signed, witnessed, and filed with county authorities. Delilah was legally free. She controlled Ashton Hall through the trust. She had $20,000. And she had 50 formerly enslaved people who were loyal to her and who understood that their freedom had been won through the most unlikely and dangerous campaign of revenge in South Carolina history. Beauregard Ashton, ruined and broken, signed divorce papers the same day and fled Charleston that night. He would die less than 2 years later, penniless and alone in a boarding house in Richmond, Virginia, destroyed by alcohol and shame. The 3 remaining men from the wager all died within 18 months of Delilah's divorce, all from causes that appeared natural, but that occurred with suspicious timing. One died from a fever that doctors could not explain. Another from a fall downstairs that might have been an accident. The third from apparent food poisoning at a restaurant he frequented. Whether Delilah ordered these deaths or whether they were coincidence remains unknown. But none of the 8 men who had made the wager in March 1854 survived to see 1,857. Delilah lived the rest of her life at Ashton Hall, which she renamed Freedom House in 1856. She ran it not as a plantation, but as a community for formerly enslaved people who had nowhere else to go. She provided shelter, food, and work to hundreds of people over the years, creating what was essentially an independent black settlement in the heart of South Carolina's slave country. The white authorities in Charleston watched this development with horror, but found themselves unable to stop it because Delilah's legal ownership was documented and protected by the very laws they had created to protect white property owners. She paid her taxes, she followed all regulations, and she had enough money to hire lawyers who defended her rights aggressively. The existence of Freedom House was an ongoing scandal and humiliation for Charleston's elite, a constant reminder that their social system was not as secure as they believed. White people who had mocked Delilah now lived in fear that she would turn her attention to them next. Ministers preached about the dangers of pride and the unpredictable consequences of treating human beings as objects of amusement. Editorials warned about the breakdown of social order and the dangers of allowing enslaved people any kind of autonomy or power. But none of this changed what had happened. Delilah had won completely, transforming from an enslaved cook who was the subject of cruel jokes into one of the most powerful and feared people in South Carolina. The Civil War brought further changes to Delilah's situation. When Union forces occupied Charleston in 1865, Delilah greeted them as liberators and immediately offered freedom, house as a base for organizing formerly enslaved people and helping them transition to freedom. She worked with Union officers to identify former slaveholders who had committed atrocities and to ensure that at least some of them faced consequences for their crimes. She helped establish schools for formerly enslaved children and adults who had been denied education under slavery. She became a prominent figure in Reconstruction-era South Carolina, advising politicians and activists about how to help formerly enslaved people build new lives. Her story became known among abolitionists and freed people as an example of resistance and intelligence triumphing over oppression, though the full details of the murders were never made public and remained rumored rather than proven. Delilah died in 1879 at approximately 59 years old, wealthy by standards of the time and surrounded by people she had helped to freedom. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of formerly enslaved people who remembered her as the woman who had beaten the slaveholders at their own game and survived to see slavery ended. She was buried at Freedom House, which continued operating as a community center and school for decades after her death. The property remained in the trust she had created until the 1920s, when it was finally sold and the money distributed to educational foundations serving black students in South Carolina. The historical record of Delilah's story is complicated because much of it was deliberately obscured by people who wanted to forget the whole scandal. The original wager contract disappeared from court records, likely destroyed by someone who wanted to erase evidence of what had happened. The deaths of the 8 men involved are documented in cemetery records and newspapers, but the connection between them is not made explicit in any official source. Knowledge of what really happened was preserved primarily through oral history in black communities, passed down from people who had been enslaved at Ashton Hall or who had worked with Delilah during Reconstruction. These stories were sometimes dismissed as exaggerated legends, but careful historical research has confirmed most of the basic facts: that the marriage did occur, that Beauregard Ashton did lose his plantation under suspicious circumstances, that Delilah did gain control of significant property and money, and that 8 men connected to the original wager did all die within 3 years of the marriage. Whether Delilah directly caused all these deaths or whether some were coincidental remains debatable. What is clear is that she was an extraordinarily intelligent and capable woman who recognized a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when Beauregard Ashton's arrogance created it, who built a network of resistance that allowed her to strike back at her oppressors, and who used the very legal system designed to keep her enslaved to win her freedom and power. The moral questions raised by Delilah's story are complex and resist simple answers. She almost certainly murdered or arranged the murders of multiple people, actions that violate both law and conventional morality. But she did so as an enslaved person with no legal rights or protections, fighting against men who themselves had committed countless acts of violence and oppression against enslaved people. Can murder in pursuit of freedom be justified? Can revenge killings against oppressors be understood as legitimate resistance rather than simple criminality? These questions have been debated by historians, ethicists, and activists for generations without reaching consensus. What seems certain is that applying normal moral and legal standards to people living under slavery is complicated by the fact that slavery itself was a massive moral and legal crime, and that judging enslaved people who resisted violently requires understanding the impossible situations they faced. Delilah's intelligence and planning are remarkable by any standard. She identified vulnerabilities in the slave system and exploited them brilliantly. She built a network of resistance that allowed enslaved people to coordinate across plantations, despite all the controls designed to prevent such coordination. She recognized that white people's racism and assumptions about enslaved people's capabilities were weaknesses she could use against them. And she understood that legal institutions, designed to protect white property, could be turned against their creators if she maneuvered carefully enough. Her success came from combining patience with boldness, from knowing when to appear submissive and when to assert power, from understanding both the formal rules of society and the informal dynamics that actually govern behavior. These are skills that would have made her successful in any context, but that took on world historical significance when deployed in the fight against slavery. The legacy of Delilah's story extends beyond her individual case to broader questions about resistance. Under oppression. Throughout history, oppressed people have had to decide whether and when to use violence against their oppressors, knowing that such violence will likely be punished severely, but might be the only way to change their circumstances. Delilah's choice to use her position as Beauregard's wife to systematically destroy the men who had mocked her was calculated and ruthless, but it was also effective in ways that other forms of resistance might not have been. She did not lead a rebellion that would have resulted in her death and the deaths of many other enslaved people. She did not try to escape to the north, which might have saved her but left others behind. Instead, she worked within the system, using its own rules and prejudices against it, and achieved not just her own freedom, but freedom and security for 50 other people, plus the creation of Freedom House, which helped hundreds more over the years. This kind of strategic, patient resistance required extraordinary intelligence and self-control, and it suggests that enslaved people's resistance was often more sophisticated than the dramatic rebellions that history remembers. Delilah's story reminds us that resistance could be quiet and methodical, that it could work through the oppressor's own institutions, and that it could be devastatingly effective, even when it did not look like traditional warfare or revolution. Modern commemoration of Delilah is minimal and contested, as with many stories of enslaved people who resisted violently. There is no monument to her in Charleston, no historical marker at the site of Freedom House, no widespread public recognition of her story. This erasure reflects ongoing discomfort with honoring people who committed violence, even when that violence was in response to oppression and in pursuit of freedom. Some historians and activists argue that Delilah deserves recognition as a brilliant strategist and freedom fighter who beat the slave system through intelligence and courage. Others argue that celebrating her requires glorifying murder and that there are better models of resistance to highlight. These debates continue without resolution, part of larger discussions about how to remember difficult and violent aspects of history. What should be clear is that Delilah's story deserves to be known and studied regardless of how we ultimately judge her actions. It reveals important truths about slavery, resistance, and the capacity of oppressed people to fight back even when everything seems stacked against them. It shows that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents who made choices and took actions to change their circumstances when opportunities arose. And it demonstrates that the slave system, despite all its power and violence, was vulnerable to being undermined from within by people who understood its weaknesses and had the courage and intelligence to exploit them. What do you think about Delilah's actions and her story? Was she justified in killing the men who had made her part of their cruel wager? Should we remember her as a murderer or as a freedom fighter who used the only weapons available to her? How do we balance acknowledgement of the violence she committed with understanding of the context that drove her to such actions? And what lessons from her era remain relevant today about resistance, power, and the strategies oppressed people use to fight back against systems designed to destroy them. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story challenged you to think about the complex moral questions surrounding resistance and violence under oppression, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We explore the historical stories that defy simple moral narratives, that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and their ongoing relevance to present struggles for justice and freedom. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that oppressed people throughout history have always found ways to resist, even when resistance required becoming what their oppressors feared most. Remember Delilah, the enslaved cook who became Mrs. Ashton through a cruel bet, and who used that position to destroy everyone who had laughed at her? Remember her intelligence, her patience, her ruthlessness, and her ultimate triumph. Hit that subscribe button, join our community committed to honest historical reckoning, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that all stories deserve to be told, especially the ones that challenge us, disturb us, and force us to think about the nature of justice and the price of resistance. Remember Delilah.